The door opened with a violent shriek and a metal clang. The room was dark, only for the faint outlines of clutter and cables gave the room any shape or texture. A figure silently pulled itself from the light of the corridor into the darkness. Lights? The room remained dark. Lights? The woman let out an audible sigh and muttered under her breath as she took hold of the stray cable that might act as leverage just as the door clanged to a close. "Dr. Madelung, are you in here?" she said, confident of an answer, but never came. Again, she muttered under her breath. She took a breath again and spoke. "Dr. Madelung, you better be in here, or what?" A voice came from the opposite side of the room. With a hum and a flicker, the lights came on. To the uninitiated, the room was a complete mess. To Eros, it was a hive of scientific discovery and equipment. He yawned, rubbing his eyes, his lab coat wrapped around him, covered in burn marks and stains. "Dr. Madelung, I am Miss Basirat. I am here representing Mr. DeFeer and the Hutton Orbital Trucker Cooperative. Your scientific work has been very valuable, and your service to the cooperative has been exemplary. But we're closing your lab here at the Orbital, and we feel your work could be best done elsewhere. This is about that scrapped anaconda on the salvage bay, isn't it? I told them I'd have it moved. As for the beluga that turned up with 80 passengers, all wanting free anaconda, you can't prove that was me, or I had anything to do with that. Like, at all." His eyes darted around, checking for any flyers he might not have disposed of. "Look, Eros, those two incidents. It's about the power surges, the dangerous productions of frameshift fields, the shifting of the orbital's trajectory, the crashing of the main computers, and the power surges." "You said power surges twice. You have tripped the main distribution breaker on no less than 100 occasions, Doctor, in the last 2 years. And you complain about me mentioning it twice. This is the problem, Doctor. I'm reaching the point where a breakthrough is right around the corner. Yes, a standard excuse the cooperative has accepted on no less than 20 occasions. So, where is this breakthrough? Well?" Eros let out a sigh. "I have published no less than 10 research papers of frameshift capacitance and energy transfer from space distortion to usable energy. I'm the only one doing any research into those damn mugs and the weird properties that they have. Everyone else forgot about what was started here. The cooperative has spread, but have we really forgotten the mug? Or is it just an amusing war cry now?" "It is the decision of the cooperative to make you an offer. We will provide you with a research vessel to do with as you please. It will be loaded out for your experiments, and you're not being cut off and removed, Doctor. We just can't have you continually causing problems aboard Hutton Orbital. It's simply costing us too much, both in trade and in lost time." Eros smiled and moved into view. He looked at the woman and instantly recognized her from the various hearings he had attended. He couldn't really remember her name. He had only heard it once, and like most people's names, it was lost to him in a matter of moments. Who is going to fly this mystery vessel? I mean, after our incident in 3302, for which, for the record, was not my fault, the Pilots Federation revoked my license. There appears to be a pattern, never taking responsibility for everything. Well, that's not true. I admit all those events you described. I just don't think they're a problem. Besides, your list didn't include brownouts, of which have occurred roughly... Eros squinted and looked at the flickering light above him. 1.52 times more frequently than the breaker trips. So, what is this vessel and who is the pilot? Wait, are you the pilot? He pointed at her and realized that this was not the best introduction should this be the case. Already being on a person's bad side was going to make the future less than a pleasant experience. Eros drifted along the corridor towards the docking area. He had been told by Sima to report to Bay 4. Bay 4 was the graveyard, an area used largely for storage of bulky and otherwise hard-to-handle equipment. It boasted a plethora of lifting equipment, storage bays, and machine tools. As he turned the corner, he saw Sima waiting for him at the main entrance. It was sealed closed, the red light above her flashing. This suggested a vacuum was behind it. Eros quickly grounded himself and activated his boots, taking a few awkward steps before moving into a more natural gait. He approached Sima and stopped. She was holding a digital checkboard, a remlock peak from under her collar of her station-issue jumpsuit. Thank you for following station regulations in the docking areas, at least while I was looking anyway. So, what is behind that needs vacuum testing? Don't tell me the rumors of a free anaconda at Hutton Orbital will no longer be a myth. What's the big secret? He smiled. Sima, in response, cracked a smile just at the corner of her mouth, an otherwise fixed, stern expression. Not even you are that lucky, Doctor. What is behind this door is an experimental ass build. It is the Explorer variant. The internal components have been partially engineered to support your research. Here is the equipment manifest. She handed him a checkboard, and he began to scan down it, starting loudly before reaching a mutter. His eyes opened, and he looked at her excitedly. Is this a typo? It has 2 frameshift drives? That is no typo. It has, or at least will have, 2 frameshift drives. Like I said, this is a customized research vessel, so I hope it tells you that the cooperative is not, how did you put it, kicking you out like a worthless piece of trash? It is instead realizing that your work has outgrown your lab on the orbital, and for the safe continuation of your research, and the operation of Hutton Orbital, of course, they are simply asking you to perform it on your own property, with their backing. Remember, Dr. Madelung, this ASP is your property, and the contents are your responsibility. That doesn't really solve the issue of a pilots federation and my suspended license, he said, his eyes still buried reading the list. That is where you are wrong. Once this vessel is vacuum-worthy, we'll be performing your recertification, she said, confidently, making herself stand tall as though like a proud soldier. Excuse me? Nervous you will fail, Doctor? Sima scoffed. A little, yes. I've not flown in a long time. You're a smart man. It'll come back to you. That isn't funny, he said, handing her the checkboard. She grabbed it and span it around and began pressing. Fine. Great. So, what is the flight suit for? Are you coming with me on this trip? I am doing your certification. And yes, as a matter of fact, I am coming with you. Oh, shit. Oh, shit indeed, Doctor. Docking request approved. Proceed to landing bay 3. Welcome home, Commander. Eros recognized the voice. It brought back a little bit of a nostalgic feeling. Sima, located on the bottom cockpit, has been watching his every move and judging even the manner in which he communicated. With this in mind, formal would be the most astute approach. Lakon Echo Romeo Oscar, on approach to landing pad number 3. A minute or so later, the ASP carefully touched down, the engine cycled to standby, and the magnetic clamps engaged, firmly attaching it to Hutton Orbital as though it was a single piece of metal. Behind him, Eros heard Sima climb the ladder. He disengaged his flight seat and set his mag boots on the deck. The good news is that you will be reinstated. The bad news for both of us is that you are ready to go, and I, thanks to either poor career choice or judgment, will be your assigned pilot and assistant. Oh, I'm sorry. I doubt that. Sorry is an overused expression. I think it went out of use some 3,000 years ago, maybe even earlier. For what it's worth, I am sorry that you have to come with me. To be honest, I'd certainly like the company, but never if it's against somebody's will. I mean, both of us might as well be in the brick. Well, I don't really have anything holding me back, so all I ask is that we live by a few rules, she said, holding herself upright with the ladder. 1, I'm off limits. I used to be a slave, and no, I'm not an imperial. Which brings me cleanly to my second rule. I'm not your servant or slave. I do not pick up your shit or clean your clothes. We will be independent unless mutually beneficial agreements come around. 3, I do not need small talk or chit-chat to survive. Sorry if you do, but I don't. If I don't look like I want to talk, I probably don't. So, number 4, stick time will be split 50-50. And I guess the last rule would be, if we fight, we must agree to solve any issue within 24 hours. No bullshit grudges. Well, those are respectable, and you read my file most likely, so you'll know that I'm an Imperial. For the record, I don't feel comfortable about our culture's way of selling dishonor into slavery. I've survived on food capsules so long that my cooking will be somewhat minimal. I'll certainly offer you food or drink whenever I am taking some. Call it a habit. So let's make this as painless for both of us as possible. May I ask a question? Sure. Are you interested in science at all? No. Eros sighed. This could be more difficult than we first thought. Alright, well, maybe a little. Okay, then I will keep my theoretical ramblings away from you, but if you do find me talking to myself, it's normal. I will just inform you of any experiments I'm going to perform. Speaking of which, when do we get my lab on board? You see that box over there? Sima pointed out of the cockpit. Eros followed the line of her arm and saw a cargo container being moved under the ship. Well, I guess that's that then. I just have one request. You want all the megagin the orbital will let you carry. Well, actually it was something else, but now that you remind me, let's make it 2 requests? Let's call the gin my request, so what's yours? Please don't call me doctor. Only arrogant assholes demand their academic titles be used on a daily basis. Eros or Madelung is fine. Hell, even just Oi is okay. Surprising. I always thought you academics loved the honorifics. So, for your research, we need to visit Farseer to get that second drive installed, by the way. Farseer? Oh, well, can we not go to see Elvira? It's Farseer over the Professor. Farseer has already been briefed, so the cooperative would rather we see her. Okay, Farseer it is, he sighed. Problems? Well, I may have suggested that Palin and Farseer don't know anything about frameshift drives while drunk at a conference. Felicity was equally drunk. It was the banquet, and she loves to drink. My gosh, she can hold her own. She laughed it off and came back at me about my lack of business sense and some snipe about me having mods. It was all good fun, but I'm a little bit embarrassed that I actually tried to hit on her later. Needless to say, she laughed that off too. Palin? Palin doesn't drink. He responded by giving me a dressing down in the morning session afterwards in front of the whole community, suggesting I don't have a legitimate doctorate. Even among the more relaxed of us academics, that's just out of order. I may or may not have stood up and called him a Thargoid-loving moron, and he may have thrown a glass of water at me. One thing led to another, and I got jumped on by security. Kids, a lot of you, Sima tutted. The Asp slowly lifted from the surface, its engineering complete, laden with equipment and supplies to last for as long as any reasonable person would want to out in space. After passing 10,000 meters, Eros set the controls to maintain a star-guided flight path away from the planet and disengaged the controls. He put his foot on the center console and pressed the communications interface. It beeped for a few moments, and then Felicity's face appeared on screen. Off so soon, I see, Doctor, she said with a yawn. It was indeed an antisocial hour. Eros was running short of sleep himself. Miss Farseer, he replied, frowning at the screen. Yes, I know. Anyway, Eros, it was good of you to visit, and it's only a shame we could not speak more. As I said, probably while we drank, we have a common interest, you and I. We both obsess over frameshift drives. I tweak them, make them a little bit better. You sift through scraps of destroyed drives to look for residual energy. I wish you luck in your pursuit, and imparting the properties of a mug onto other materials at will. I feel, though, that this quirk out of Hutton Orbital is as joked as the place itself. Yes, it is interesting how few people take it seriously. Well, I mean, you can forgive them a little. We already have drinks containers that can keep liquid warm, even boil it on command, so yet another device on the market that you have to fly a long way to obtain. I think people see it as a bit of a gimmick. Not to mention all the fakes. Exactly. Regardless, thank you for the gift. It might not get as much use as it should, as I don't tend to do that much in the way of flying these days. It still gets pride of place in my collection, however. It's an oil catcher for that old faraway drive, isn't it? Well, yes, and you will know how much esteem I hold it, now that you know that. Actually, yeah, I do. Anyway, I just wanted you to know that the experimental drive you installed on the ship will be put to good use, and I'll be heading out to Maya. And I'll be using the black hole's gravitational well to take some data and perform some experiments. You don't need Maya for that. A gravitational well of Palin's ego is enough to boil water without using a Hutton Mug. Godspeed, Eros. Send me a copy of the papers if you want me to review them. Thanks. Oh, and another thing. When you get a moment, you might want to liberate a bottle of my special homebrew from compartment 12B in the drive room. It's pretty good, and not at all like that rocket fuel you drank the last time you visited. As I say, Godspeed. Don't talk to any naughty Thargoids out there. Not so sure I'll have any choice of the matter if the Thargoid was interested in me. Well, not in this ship, anyway. True enough, but all the same. Sima sat in the communal area, her flight suit unclipped at her neck. She looked exhausted. Although the ship was an Asp Explorer renowned for long jump range, due to the extra weight it carried, it only boasted a modest 35 light-year jump capacity, even with all the third-party mods. As Eros wanted to take gravitational data and perform material studies for each jump cycle, they were less than a third into the journey, and already hitting the 28-hour mark. Sima's eyes were dark, her skin pale, and glistened with sweat. With her head pressed on the table, she gently lifted a rubber ball a few centimeters away from the surface and carefully let it go, watching it very slowly drift down. She counted out loud. Eros drifted through the hallway, reaching the communal area, silently catching the bar and stopping himself. He saw her exhaustion. He felt it himself. He had been far too excited about setting up and taking measurements than to care about himself or his crewmate. Miss Basirat, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Whatever, Eros, she said slowly, carefully pronouncing each syllable. You're tired. I'm tired. I got carried away. And if you're not tired to the point of sickness, let's kick back, take a day. I'm up for stick time, so if there's anything you want to see, I'm your taxi. Look, whatever, I don't care. Oh, come now. I know that isn't true. Just, she shouted and threw the ball at him, hitting him square in the forehead. It bounced off and around the cabin. After 10 seconds, she caught it and looked down at it in her hand. Eros floated, stunned at what had just happened. Eros, I'm sorry, I shouldn't never have done that. It's just, look, I'm used to station life. I was a slave, remember? I lived my life by a strict schedule, everything pre-planned and predetermined. We have been on board for only 5 days, and I am at my breaking point. I'm weak and I'm freaking out. Calm down, I understand. That's why I want to take this day off. I'm used to working on my own, keep my own weird hours, and I've always had that freedom. We've been awake for what, 27 hours now? 30. Okay, 30, and no one should do that without stimulants, so let's check the database and see if we can go somewhere nice, rather than letting me bury my head in numbers and calibrations. How is the data? Is it useful? Very useful. Most of the equipment is calibrated and cross-calibrated. It's in really great shape for once. I normally have to bodge for cross-calibrations and eyeball things. I've also got the machine shop working, the refinery's ready, and the sensors are tuned. Good, she sighed, as she watched Eros take a seat in front of her. Is there an Earth-like nearby, or at least somewhere we can go without a full suit? I'll take a look at the database in the morning, then. He made a note in his communicator and bonked his head down on the table, just as she had been when he floated in. Eros stood on the command deck, beside the flight seat. A deep purple sky with what seemed like an atmosphere that spread the clouds right to the stars cast an unnatural red light, as though this planet was in perpetual dusk. Below was a large body of water. Almost dead steady, it displayed a perfect mirror copy of the sky in the horizon. It was not recommended to explore Earthlikes. The Tri-Power Exploration Charter required specialist equipment to be on board the ships that would go exploring, and in order to reduce the impact on delicate alien ecosystems and the possible risk of unknown contagions. These were essentially automated sterilization airlocks, and flight suits equipped with microbe handling. It was not perfect, although, unless a person did something very stupid or was physically attacked, the amount of medical knowledge humanity had gathered over its conquests meant much of this was low risk. The water rippled. Sima had just dipped in her toe, looking amused at just how still it was. Surface tension defined the position of the shoreline. It was as if the water level was a few millimeters above where her dry foot held her weight. Eros retreated back into the ship. She was very attractive, although he had agreed to give her her privacy. He had already broken that agreement by stepping foot on the cockpit. It was easy to see why. Her body was pockmarked with old injuries. Progenitors could easily take care of them, but their significance to her was quite clear. He stepped away from the seat. As he turned, he saw the light flicker against the door. He looked back and squinted at the star through the polarizing canopy. There was something that had just passed in front of it. A ship? Out here? He exclaimed quietly. Celeste, search and track for nearby objects, optical and IR in the vicinity of the local host star. Yes, Commander. Searching. Please wait. Object located at a distance of 500 kilometers, displaying live telescope feed from instrument 12. A fuzzy blob appeared on the monitor screen. It was hard to tell what it was through the atmosphere. The upper levels were surprisingly turbulent, given the dead stillness of the surface. Celeste continued. Unable to identify object. Current velocity, estimated from proper motion, is 0.5 meters per second. Echo measurements at a negative 3,000 meters per second. Current projection and distance place time of arrival in 2 minutes. Thargoid? He said, as a rough hexagonal form began to emanate out from the fuzz. Identification confirmed, Commander. Object identifies as Interceptor class of unknown variant. Celeste, cold start the ship. Drop the steps. Put the cockpit on external speakers. Confirmed. Celeste's ever-calm voice warmed the cockpit as the clanking sound of the steps lowered, echoing around the hull. Sima, you have to get back on board. There is a Thargoid interceptor inbound. Sima, turn your goddamn music off. Outside, she didn't respond. She continued to look at the water and the landscape without a single care. Shit, Eros exclaimed. He leapt forward and into the flight seat and began rapidly pressing buttons as Celeste started up the various systems one by one. Celeste, priority 1, give me the mining lads. Commander, that would be in violation of the treaties governing. I don't care. I need to get her attention. Maneuvering thrusters are online, Commander. Oh, okay. 2-second burst, 5% brake capacity. Now. The ship fired its downward-facing thrusters briefly, instantly sending a flurry of dust outwards from under it. Sima was knocked forward, face first into the water. She glared back at the cockpit. What the fucking hell do you think you're doing, you piece of... Sima, shut up and get back on board. Now, we have an incoming Thargoid. You have 1 minute. Without a single word, she picked herself up and began to run towards the ship. Getting roughly halfway, she saw it for herself, rapidly approaching, in cone configuration. What do we do? Eros asked. He'd not really educated himself with the best practices around Thargoids. He had hoped he'd never encounter one, even if the news claimed they marched ever closer. We hope they don't have any Guardian tech or anything that pisses it off. I'm not sure what we can do, really. Whatever you do, don't activate any hardpoints. About 10 seconds from there was a loud crack. Sima stumbled and fell to the ground. Eros could hear her gasping and wheezing, trying to force her lungs to take a breath. The vessel had dropped from hypersonic flight some time ago, and the shockwave had just reached the surface. Sima turned over and looked up as the vessel came to rest, casting its long, foreboding flower shape over the ship. Eros, get your equipment running. Don't worry about me. I'll be back on board or get taken. Just whatever you do, get the data you can. If it doesn't attack, it doesn't attack, and we'll just chalk this one down to a story we tell in the bars, okay? Eros, it's opening up. Move, Sima, get up and get back on the ship. If I move, it'll probably attack. If you don't, it still might attack. Eros looked down through the canopy. The dust had settled enough to see. She was laying face up, her legs bent at the knee, her elbows lifting her head, and was slowly pushing herself backwards against the dirt. Now. Do it now, Sima. Slowly if you have to, but move. Do not stay there. She slowly lifted herself, stood, and began backstepping towards the ship. After 10 or so steps, she turned and restarted her sprint towards the steps in what felt like the longest 10 seconds and hardest climb of her life. She grabbed and pulled... Oh, what the fuck? After 10 or so steps, she turned and restarted her sprint towards the steps, and in what felt like the longest 10 seconds and the hardest climb of her life, she grabbed and pulled down on the emergency release bar. The door rapidly opened, projecting a rush of air outwards. She jumped inside and hit the safe switch, which started the cleaning process. I'm on board, Eros, I'm on board. Good. Get up here as soon as you can. What's it doing? Strangely, nothing. It's just hovering here. There seems to be a haze around it, likely from the re-entry, I guess. It looks, from its almost jet black surface, that it's one of the more aggressive ones, but I can't tell if that colour is pigmentation or it's scorching. Oh, wait, something's... The loud bellowing horn-like cry of the ship that had become a staple of the species' interaction with humans made every surface in the ship vibrate. Did it scan us? No. No, at least I don't think so. It just honked at us. What is it doing here? I thought they were only ever interested in ammonia worlds. Are there any registered barnacles or structures around here? None in the database. We're far too close to the bubble for that. Once again, the Thargoid ship bellowed at the grounded asp, this time rotating its flower petals in a fan blade-like action by 180 degrees. It was slowly changing colour. It might be healing. As he finished his sentence, the green-like yellow gill structures lit up, and it once again bellowed, this time illuminating the ship with an alien light, spreading its petals for what seemed like an eternity. The mighty vessel hung in the air, this time almost in complete silence, as though it was considering their right to continue breathing and their onward journey. Sima stepped onto the bridge, out of breath and shaking. She looked up at the Thargoid. She had only ever seen them on Galnet. They imparted an enormous fear in her, far worse than anything she had experienced before. Water dripped onto the floor, making a rhythmic tapping sound, as both commanders felt as they had been frozen in time, waiting for either death or salvation. Finally the petals began to fold inwards, and the Thargoid vessel slowly began to ascend, causing an audible sigh of relief to be expelled by both human occupants. Sima, I want to follow it, Eros said immediately, and began flicking toggles on the flight seat. Are you out of your mind? Sima gasped. No, I need to follow it. Listen, He turned his head, his gaze completely filled by her bikini and sand-covered body. He looked up at her face. The community doesn't know a great deal about their jump technology. I need to study its wake signature, even perhaps keep the wake open. Let me guess, I'm on stick and you're on instruments. That's probably the most effective arrangement, yes. Fine. Let me suit up so I can get into that seat, and I need 2 minutes. Just start following it, you absolute idiot. Gentle, though. Remember, I'm not strapped down, and I'd rather not get squished, Sima said as she exited the cockpit and headed towards one of the suit-up lounges. The ship began to hum and vibrate as Eros engaged the thrusters and lifted clean off the ground. The Thargoid was 20 kilometers away already, almost straight up. It didn't look like it was going to make as speedy as an escape as it did with its entry. How long do you suppose it's going to keep flying? We've been following it for 3 hours now, while all it does is nothing but fly in a straight line, Sima said, yawning, covering her mouth with her hand. Thargoids obviously have a higher threshold for boredom. I mean, the planet below is beautiful, but still. Maybe they simply don't have a concept of boredom. Can't get bored if you don't know it. Boredom is a thing, Eros replied from his desk in the sensor suite. They had indeed been flying and tracking the interceptor from a distance of about 20 kilometers for long enough that the initial intensity of the situation had long since waned. What are you looking for or planning to do now that you have had 3 hours down there to set up? Well, the jump process has to generate a large energy signature. They look biological in nature, but still have to follow the same physics processes. It has to remain cool on the inside, at least cool enough for their species. So we might expect a large heat output. Well, to be sure, I've got all the instruments down here online. We have a Compton telescope for gamma and X-rays. I have a suite of spectrometers trained on it. It gets us from extreme UV through to extended IR. And below that, I have microwave and radio interferometers. There are a few gaps, but, well, we've pretty much got most of the EM spectrum covered. As for particle detection, I have a tracking chamber strapped on the outside of the hull. We can't get the lighter stuff like neutrinos, but it'll do. Sure, okay, sounds like you've got it covered. We could try and get its attention, non-aggressively. How so? I suppose spook it somehow. I can plot a jump almost in line with it, and do something like go silent until the indicator hits 95%, then open the vents again. We will light up like a candle. It would at least check whether it's actually keeping an eye on us. Sure, okay, let's do it. Alright, Course is plotted and silent running. There was a slight change in the hum that emanated through the ship. The cooling systems entered a partial bypass of the regular heat vents, instead opting to cook the buffer tanks. 70%, 80%, 90%. Alright, that's the lot, switching to standard power. Anything? What's Eros? Words. Use words. Its radio signal's changed. It's sort of reduced by a factor of, 2-ish, and then went back to normal. Did it flip around? I don't have a telescope live feed, he said in a serious, dull tone. I think, yes, it did. It's facing us, but it didn't change velocity. It's hard to tell from this distance if it's changing configuration or anything, Sima replied, leaning her head over to the left, squinting at the information panel. Wait, it's coming right at us. Hit the frameshift drive. We need to get out of here. The hum of the drive system increased in intensity, and Celeste counted down as the Thargoid came alongside. Its petals extended, the hue of its gills now red. The asp snapped into witch space. They both sat back in their chairs and sighed in unison, though they wouldn't have known it, being the different parts of the ship. This data is not worth dying for. I think all we know is that they have a low threshold for bullshit or aggression, Eros said. He looked at what little data he had. Most of it looked like noise. There'd been a small heat increase when the vessel raced towards them, but little else. It wasn't even clear what the propulsion system was. There'd been a trail of ions left behind the ship, but it didn't really appear to be a propellant. There simply wasn't enough of it to throw a ship of that size around like they saw. It looked like ammonia. No surprise there. The main frameshift drive began to alert the cockpit to an instability. Both occupants knew what was happening. The Thargoid vessel was not going to let them leave that easily. Warning, hyperspace conduit unstable, Celeste announced. Eros knew this would hurt. Sima, hold your breath, let go of the controls, and hold on to yourself. What? Sima replied as the ship twisted out of control before roughly dropping from hyperspace, between the origin and destination. Sima gasped. It was nauseating. She coughed any liquids out of her throat and spat them at the ground next to the chair, clearing the sensation of choking brought on by the collapse of the frameshift field. She took hold of the controls and moved them gently. Nothing happened. The controls are dead, Eros. Eros, do you hear me? He didn't. The ship had entirely shut down. The power plant was in the process of venting plasma into space, as though it was in an emergency state. Complete and total silence. The Thargoid interceptor drifted slowly up to the canopy, its central glass dome-like eye a swirling mix of confusion and reflections. Sima looked back, her eyes this time fixed with anger more than fear. If the main computer was running, Sima would have heard the Thargoid bellow at the asp once more. Instead, the void of space silenced its otherwise intimidating scream. The ship drifted backwards and began rotating. A low hum began to grow within the ship, and a quiet voice came through the speakers. Sima, don't activate anything. I need to get us into cruise mode. It won't follow us if we can get that far enough away. How? The power plant needs to cold start. I know, which is why the second frameshift drive is going to activate. For about 4 seconds from the auxiliary cells. It should be enough to get us, 120 kilometers or something away. It won't be much, but a cold start has already been initiated. We need about 2 minutes. We can remain drifting until you think it's going to get aggressive. That is hard to know, and I can't see what is happening outside. Eros's eyes bolted open, and he jolted upwards. If it wasn't for the sleep restraint, he'd have face planted into the top bunk. He rubbed his eyes, though it didn't help the stinging fatigue. They had been stranded for 3 days now. Most of the systems were online, though the frameshift drives remained inoperable. Eros was the only one who had any expertise and chance at salvaging the drive between the two of them. Eros estimated for the amount of time the frameshift drive was online, along with acceleration, they had made it around 10 light seconds before tumbling out, a much greater distance than expected. Lights? The main lamp instantly lit the room. He listened to the hum of the ship. It sounded normal. He undid the restraints and pushed against the wall. With a couple of pushes from nearby grab bars, he was navigating his way to the cockpit. The ship was in complete silence other than the regular hum. It didn't feel like there was any rotation, so at least they hadn't had any problems overnight. Celeste, ship status, please. Status is nominal. No problems detected. No problems detected? That doesn't sound right. Status of frameshift drive. Frameshift drive is operational. Current mode, idle. Eros frowned. When he went to sleep, the drive definitely wasn't operational. He neared the cockpit door. It was open. A little unusual, he thought. He could see the top of Sima's head in the pilot seat as he moved into the cockpit and stopped himself. Sima, good job on getting the drive online. Commander, Sima Basirat is dead, Celeste responded. What? He felt a dark foreboding, and his heart began to race. He swung himself around the seat to see her. Sima? Sima! Talk to me, Sima, he shouted, grabbing at and shaking her shoulders. A bead of blood drifted from her nose, and her closed eyes slowly opened. They, she whispered. Incoming message. Not now, Celeste. They, Sima? They? He said, his panic heightening as what appeared before him was someone at the point close to death. They won't stop until we are all dead. The cockpit lit up red as the ship began to vibrate. He looked behind him out of the cockpit. The Thargoid vessel almost completely filled the view. Incoming message. Connect. You will die out here. You will all be purged like abominations. Cracks appear, snaking around the cockpit, until finally it breaks. Eros tries to cover his face as the air begins to explode outwards. Eros hits his head against the top of the bunk, his eyes filled with terror, his heart pounding hard like it's about to explode. Shit, he exclaims. He takes a few moments to look around the badly lit room. Incoming communication, Celeste said calmly. Connect, Eros said with a shaky voice. Eros, you okay? I heard a bump and a scream. I'm fine, I guess. The bump was my head. I have no idea about the scream, though. His voice now more calm. I was projecting. The scream was me. I had a terrible dream. Well, if we're both awake, we may as well get started on that drive. Can't let us just die out here, can we? I hope not. We're less than a week into this. That'd be just embarrassing, he said, with a quiet chuckle. They both held their breath as the frameshift drive began to slowly spool up and charge. Sima at the controls, Eros in the engine room making fine adjustments to power flow, coolant, and field containment dials. All of it could be done remotely, of course, but he was just used to tinkering around in a more hands-on approach. We have all greens, oh my god, 1 week to pretty much strip down and rebuild this bastard, but we finally did it, Eros exclaimed. Hey, don't call it names, it might decide to break, Sima chuckled. Plot a course back. We only made it a few light seconds. We should be able to hit hyperspace travel. If not, we could supercruise a long way. Strap yourself in. I'm bringing her about. The ship began to steadily forward motion and rotate to bring the destination in view. The alignment lights activated, and the drive moved from idle into active mode. After a 10-second wait, Celeste counted down. Though to them, it was not just a computer, it was an angel handing down deliverance. The asp snapped into hyperspace with a thunderous crack, and Eros continued to rapidly make adjustments. Sima, I have a feeling that... Warning, hyperspace conduit unstable, Celeste interrupted. That is going to happen. I'm going to try and manually compensate. I have a feeling that the onboard systems massively overshoots what it needs to do in order to prevent this from being a fatal drop. Well, the conduit hasn't dropped yet, so whatever you're doing, keep doing it. We're about to hit the exit point. We might drop directly superluminal, so again, prepare for that. He was right. The ship dropped, this time more elegantly. The host G-class star streamed into view, and the ship drew to a relative halt before continuing into conventional flight. This time the ASP hadn't practically folded itself in half. Its systems remained online. Our distress call is out. Doubt anyone would come to our aid, though. So I guess it's more of a Thargoids were here marker than anything else, Sima said, tapping a few buttons around the cockpit. She jumped in her seat as the interceptor passed overhead and moved in close to the cockpit once more. Listen, we just want to be on our way. Sorry to disturb you. I'm making as much of our ship cold as I can this time. I just want it to scan us and move off, and then we can break this weird loop we're in. We piqued its interest. As terrified as I am right now, is it just me, or does it seem less than the enormous killing machine we're led to believe it has to be? This one, yes, the stories I've heard always point to the Thargoids as monsters. They certainly do appear to be that. But again, we are too at times. Great, I'm flying with a sympathizer. No, not at all. But when you're a scientist, you learn that the grass is never greener on the other side. Take a step back and try and see the big picture. We're not innocent. INRA did some pretty bad stuff, and if those leaks in the news were to be believed. That as well may be, but as the saying goes, the sins of the father. The interceptor circled the asp, appearing to inspect each panel, twitching slightly as it moved, occasionally performing full rotations. They both watched it on the outside instruments, looking for any sign that it would turn on them. Sima sat with her hands on her legs, away from the controls. Eros collected as much data as he could. After 30 minutes, the interceptor moved off, slowly drifting away while still facing them, before turning and making a cone shape out of its petals and opening a hyperspace tunnel. That's the sign. Get on top of that wake signature. I think I can keep it open to study it. Eros, you are insane. We should just get the hell out of here. We're safe now, I promise you that. It won't come back. It has no reason to, and we only have about 2 minutes before that closes. Fine. You're still insane, though. What is it? Just answer me that, Sima asked. I really don't know. What we're seeing doesn't really exist, but, clearly it does. We see it. Open which space? It has no gravitational signature, yet it's bending light. Probes go directly through it, and they only register a change in photon flux, no charge or plasma. For all intent, it's like space-time is just emanating photons. It has to be which space? Space-time leaking photons. How? How indeed? Eros was taking as much data as he could before the wake closed fully. Sima, fly us through it, as central as you can. It won't take us anywhere. I just want to make sure we probe it every way we can. Affirmative. Sima took hold of the throttle and pushed it forward. It clicked out of the center position and glided forward. The asp moved forward in kind, its main thrusters firing and then going dark as the desired velocity was reached. They crossed the wake. The instruments on the outside of the ship lit up as though they crossed an imaginary line of the wake that remained. Okay, let us get back on the way to Maya. This data set is in the bag, and I'll do some closer inspection when I'm on stick. And on that subject, I'm on double duty. Don't suppose you want to visit an Earth-like world? No, I do not. Well, not in this area anyway, Eros remarked quickly. I hear Colonia is nice this time of year, Sima quipped back. Only way I'm going out there is in a heavily engineered Anaconda. Ooh, beluga liner for me. Kick back and be obnoxiously drunk all the way. Oh, that's an idea. If we make it back, I'll buy the drinks. Serious? Sure, why not? I'm pretty much banned from the orbital. Well, I'll think about it. Why do you suppose that Thargoid wouldn't let us leave? I have the impression it was curious about us, just as much as we were it. I'm sure they know all about different human vessels. It didn't see us as a threat. Wondered what we were doing in its back garden, and took offense to us following it. Who knows? Well, I'm locking the controls ahead. It will put some distance between us and the wake, and, well, I suggest we hit the shower. Sima closed the communication link and decoupled from the flight seat. She flipped over it and met the door with her feet after a few moments of drift. A matter of minutes later, she was in the showers. After spending around 20 minutes cleaning and relaxing, letting the warm water splash and cling to her form in the zero-gravity environment, she stopped and took hold of her hooded towel and floated out of the shower room. Where is that dumb bastard? Can he be that stupid? She drifted to the common area to see Eros strapped to a seat looking at an information panel. Hey, good shower? He asked, without looking at her. Sima opened her towel slightly. Yes, though it would have been nicer if you weren't quite so socially inept. He looked at her directly into her deep brown eyes. She smiled, tilted her head, and looked downwards with her eyes. But you said, yes, I did say. But sometimes I need also. A confusing dancing swirl of stars greeted them dead ahead. It grew larger and more complex as the asp drew ever closer. That's about close enough, Eros said to himself. He brought the ship into a radial hold and entered orbit. Flicking a couple of toggles, the controls folded back into the seat, and he put his feet on the console ahead of him. He stared at Maya B, at the apparent void in space-time. The door opened behind him. While it was usual to remain strapped in at all times while performing maneuvers, Sima had carefully navigated from her quarters to the cockpit. What's the plan? She asked bluntly. Well, you're going to hate me for this, but, Eros said, pausing as Sima sighed very loudly and groaned, I am going to remove some of the safety features of the navigation computer. We will then be able to move into the ergosphere of Maya B. We have to obviously be careful, but once we have the ship parked there in supercruise, I'll do some experiments with the secondary frameshift drive. You are going to play with the gravitational field, right next to a black hole. I swear, if the Thargoids don't kill us, you will, she said, drifting towards the canopy, looking at the swirling distortions. And why will this help us? She reached out and touched the glass. The frameshift drive housings are what the mugs are made from, and even then it's a specific layer within that material that forms in shells. When we melt the scrap down, these layers mix. They don't lose their properties, but they just sort of dilute a little. Ever noticed that no two mugs keep the same temperature? It's because of that. Now, I have a theory that the effect is some kind of frame dragging or lens veering effect that is imparted on particles permanently. The only way that could happen is if some of the material is being turned into micro black holes, though I thought they couldn't exist due to Hawking radiation, I thought. Sima interrupted. Yeah, and we know Hawking radiation is produced by black holes. We've measured it. But I have a hunch that something breaks during rapid collapse of a frameshift field. Something we missed that imparts stability. I guess I'm on stick. Yes. As I say, I need a few hours to get around the safety interlocks and finish a display tool so you can see where the predicted outer horizon is and where the ergosphere is. We absolutely do not want to go anywhere near the horizon. Random question, and I'm sure the answer is no, but aren't we protected by the frameshift drive if we pass into the horizon? Yeah, you're correct. The answer is no. The frameshift drive can bend spacetime very much like a black hole. It does so with the expense of power rather than being a natural state. Truth be told, due to the time dilation, we still don't know the answers of the experiments which we did perform on black holes. I'd hazard a guess that it isn't worth trying. I predict that overlapping such intense gravitational fields will destroy the ship. Even passing into the ergosphere is going to cause problems for us. I don't take doing this lightly, you know. Well, that's a relief. I thought you were just being crazy. At least I know you're being serious, but crazy. How much time do we lose? Well, right now we're running back about 1 second per hour, so not too bad. We are largely protected by the frameshift field, but there is still some leakage. We will have to get much closer and move much faster. The leakage will be worse, but we're talking hours maybe? Certainly not days or weeks, or years. Confident with that estimate? Pretty confident. Eros waved his hand and smiled. Sima didn't smile back. There was a noticeable threshold, the frameshift drive growing louder and higher in pitch as it started to succumb to the large gravitational gradient. The vessel creaked as the lateral stress began to become noticeable, even to the steel. A little deeper, 500 meters more, and hold that for 30 seconds, Eros said, his voice faint over the sounds filling the air. Eros, I'm fighting with the controls up here. I'll see what I can give you. We need to stop this and get out of here as soon as we can. I can barely stop myself from vomiting, Sima replied, her voice remarkably calm. Just 30 more seconds, and then pull straight out. Easier said, frameshift drive, core temperature reaching threshold level. Van done. That is a new one. Eros, what is going on down there? Nothing. The drive just hit 95% on its capacity. It will be fine. The housing is rated for 5 times that. That's it. We're done. This is over. Sima began to pull back on her flight stick, and the nose lifted, although it was hard to tell what it was lifting into without the overlay that Eros had written. The galaxy was wrapped into a sphere-like object above them, and the rest of the surroundings appeared as a complete darkness. The sphere began to grow and unwrap, the whole object as a multi-coloured spectrum shifting from blue through red. As though the sphere turned into more of a sky-like dome, the sound of the frameshift drive began to change back into its more familiar deep tone. Brilliant, Sima. Absolutely brilliant. We're not out of the woods yet. If that drive lets go, we're going to become part of that thing faster than you can think. It is the only thing keeping this ship from wrapping itself around and inserting the cockpit through the thrusters. Did you just say we'll have our heads shoved up our assholes? I mean, the reality would be far worse, though we'd be dead before we can even get to that point. Crossing the danger threshold, we might feel a slight... There was a loud and sudden jolt that shifted the ship's trajectory downwards. Bump, Sima instantly counted. They had just left the ergosphere and its harsh frame-dragging effect. The galaxy was back where it should be, surrounding the ship, and the blackened void below fell away, becoming part of the familiar background. So, what is the damage? How much time did we lose? Will our billions in long-term investments pay out? Sima asked. There was a moment of silence as she put more distance between them and Maya B. Eros? One moment. Just updating the chronometers. Exactly 2 days, 4 hours, 23 minutes, and 42 seconds. If I run the simulations for a few moments... Wow. Well, without the frameshift drive field, I think it would be closer to 5 weeks. 5 weeks and being liquefied. How does the data look? I will need to do some analysis, but I can tell you this. We now have a ceramic plate that is maintaining a constant temperature of 50 degrees above ambient. I could successfully project a collapsing field state. Did you want to do that? I thought this was a data collection only. You are exactly correct. The loggers were running the entire time. I think we're seeing evidence of that microstructure I was telling you about. We should call it something. Frameshift crystals? The Basirat effect, after the poor pilot suffers through your lack of self-preservation. So, you're telling me you created mug material without it coming from several tons of frameshift drive wreckage? Yeah. And you can repeat it? Maybe. What is that phrase? We're going to need a bigger ship? Boat. It's most certainly boat. And by that I assume bigger power plant and frameshift drive. Exactly. Which we don't have. But with this data, I think I can form a model and possibly a whole theory of how this works. It's almost like we condensed a frameshift field into a crystal. It's a little bit like particle physics, where you create the Higgs by exciting the Higgs field. Gravity crystal? Almost. Not so much like solidified gravity, though, but like a solidified field gradient. The plate didn't change mass at all, nor did it appear to change in shape or internal structure. There is, however, a constant frameshift field present, and the drag that it's having must be what's causing it to heat up. Well, this is all well and good, but I must ask the question. Sure. What's that? Well, there's about 5 cannon ships out there, and they appear to be wanting to know what the hell we're doing. Why are you wearing that? Sima whispered over the NFC. What? This? Eros looked down and opened his lab coat, and straightened the collar, and then looked back at her. These cannon people, some of the most arrogant, snotty-nosed assholes you're ever likely to meet. Not sure that I've ever met one which wasn't weird. Sima looked back at Eros with a sarcastic expression, grinned, and then let out a laugh that she just couldn't hold back. What? Well, fine, whatever. Weirder than me. They have this whole system that favors people who have almost never had to try, and teaches them that they are like gods amongst idiots. I had a fairly normal upbringing. I wasn't sent to the academies when I was 3 or 4 years old, and constantly told that I'm the smartest person alive. My dad was a mining engineer, and my mum a cook at a local education facility. I was deemed too much of a dreamer to achieve anything by an asshole teacher when I was 7, so yeah, let's just say I realistically earned my right to be weird. Alright, keep your coat on. Sima paused and then sighed. What is taking them so long? This has to be the slowest umbilical I think I've ever seen installed. Well, 1 or 2 possibilities. Everyone on board that ship is a scientist, which means they possibly spent about triple the amount of time required arguing on who was going to press the buttons, and then they likely did a few calculations to see if the material was strong enough and would reach far enough, if the pumps are working okay, if our hull is demagnetized properly. They probably even reworked the calibration on our airlock's safety handshake. You're kidding. What's the other possibility? That I made the airlock send them back a bad handshake, and they're furiously doing what I just said because they're afraid the linkway will break. When really, it's fine. An engineer would have just shrugged it off and said, meh, it's within its spec. You really hate these guys, Sima responded, almost impressed and not at all shocked. I wouldn't say hate, I just love wasting their time. They're wasting my time, I'm wasting theirs. It's a two-way relationship. The lights on the airlock lit green. Eros leant to his left and pressed a button. And now, the piece de résistance. Sima looked at him for a moment as the airlock began to open, and then looked back as she saw him smile. The airlock opened, revealing a Cannon Orca science vessel outside, linked with a transparent umbilical. It was positioned upside down with respect to the asp. A single figure was orientated upside down in the airlock door as well. How is that even possible? Didn't they check? I mean, can't they see the ship? So, that tells you the pilot is a full-on scientist who flies almost 100% on instruments rather than, using his eyes. That makes no sense. When they attached the umbilical, they would have seen the orientation was wrong. You would think that, and you would be right. But they would also trust their instruments. It would also have caused 1 or 2 of them to scratch their heads. As I was trying to imply before, not so wise to the world, some of these guys. Anyway, Eros finished whispering and nodded his head forward and pointed at the figure who stood at the airlock. It released its boots and began using the handbars to rotate around, revealing the figure to be female. Madelung, please follow me on board the Alum. There are matters to discuss, she said. Siemens took a step forward. The woman held up her hand in response. Only you are required, Doctor. Well, I'm afraid that won't be possible. Let's call it insurance? Your friend is not required. My friend's name is Sima, and she just performed a sub-ergosphere flight. That makes her somewhat unique and important. Something even you lot haven't even attempted. Us lot? She said in a stern tone. Her eyes locked on Eros. He paused, looking at her and the orca behind her. Something felt wrong. Then, I bid you farewell, and a safe onward journey. I am not required to do a single thing. I have broken no laws. Eros waved. The figure paused for a moment and looked to her right, listening to her earpiece. He looked at her position. She had not yet passed inside the airlock. Eros quickly jolted to the side and pulled down on the emergency close lever. It was getting more use than what was probably expected on such an expedition. What are you doing? Sima shouted, holding her hand out in his direction. They are not from Cannon, he responded, while quickly spinning himself around and pushing towards the exit. Which of us is better at avoiding gunfire? Well, probably me. I'm on it. Great. Don't worry about me. I'll strap myself down the best I can. Let's just get the hell out of here. The lights and the sound of a ship went dead. Oh, you have to be kidding. Is that a shutdown pulse? Is there a Thargoid out there? He asked of the room. Sima had already left, although shouted a response which echoed around the corner. I'll tell you when I get to the cockpit. There was a large crack and a bang that caused the ship to reverberate. That sounds like standard munitions, Eros said, as a second wave hit. After several rounds of hits, everything fell silent. Eros had joined Sima on the bridge and was sitting in the lower position. So I've clocked 2 Eagles. I thought you said there were 5 ships. Where's that damn Thargoid? Eros said, with a panic. There is no Thargoid. "Come on, reboot, you stupid hunk of scrap," Sima said, thrashing at the throttle and rapidly flicking the toggles. The ship had been down for nearly 20 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. If the sounds of the munitions on the armor weren't scary enough, the sudden sound of silence certainly was. Finally, the systems began to reboot, each of the systems flicking to life as the main power distribution reset. Eros looked down at the sensor as flickering contacts danced across, and the console solidified them into 3 contacts. With a thud, 2 more contacts appeared straight ahead as the Asp boosted and hurtled forward, nearly winging 2 Vipers as they waked down into sublight. We are so fucked. I am scanning those 2 Vipers. If we're lucky, they're system authority. Oh, praise the Emperor, Eros exclaimed. Hail them, Sima. Shut up, I'm already on it. Sima pulled back on the controls and boosted once more, sending the ship into a sharp spin, rotating it back to face the 2 Vipers as they made pursuit. The 2 Eagles, flying now in what looked like wing formation, aside each Viper. We are a civilian science vessel. We have come under attack. We are armed only with a mining lance. Unknown technology was used to knock out our power systems, transferring full. Sima was interrupted as synchronized railgun volleys passed partially through the shields and showered at the side of the canopy with molten metal. The shot came from the leftmost Eagle, shortly after which the nearest Viper peeled off, causing the Eagle to make evasive maneuvers. Scan complete. Situation acknowledged. A singular message flashed on the screen. The second Viper followed suit and began engaging the other Eagle. Sima sighed and sat back in her seat. She pushed the throttle forward, firing the main thrusters, sending a roaring vibration throughout the whole ship as it came to a relative stop. Sima, what are you doing? Deploying the lance and going mining. Our shields are barely functional, and well, most of our armor is either burnt off or has so many holes in it, it may as well not even be there. I'm surprised we're keeping air on the inside of this thing, to be honest. Relax, I got this. Don't worry. She was once again interrupted as the Orca high-waked. Fine, you win. I'm going to recharge the shields while we scan that wake. Then, what is left of those Eagles are getting minced. Happy? Happy. Totally happy, Eros said, as one of the Eagles began to spin out of control and explode shortly after. This signature doesn't make any sense. They didn't high-wake anywhere. The reading is anomalous, Sima said, while locking onto the debris of the first Eagle, as the second one exploded a few kilometers behind them. Fine. Let's hope one of these assholes ejected. I'll thrash it out of them. Sima, there won't be anything left. Those pilots. It was a diversion. They gambled the authorities wouldn't make it on time and set up to jump that Orca and mask the wake. The only question that remains are, who pretends to be canon? And more importantly, has use of Thargoid technology? As they limped back to Maya A and the relative safety of Obsidian Orbital, they mused as to who could be behind it. Initially, they had thought most likely the candidate had to be the Thargod cult, though they hadn't really done anything quite so brazen in the past. This, and the fact that members of the cult tend to be entirely non-violent. It had to be something more sinister. The way the Orca docked, the simple demands made. Eros was looking over the camera footage for any markings on the Orca, though it turned up a blank, not even a registration marking. The only object he saw that looked unusual was an odd device mounted on the large hardpoint. Eros assumed it had to be the shutdown field generator. It was an object that looked almost like a compound eye, with wires and tubes protruding from it, as though it was on life support. Eros, you might want to look outside, Sima said as the Asp touched down. They were surrounded by a security detail. You know, that wasn't so bad, considering, Eros said. His voice echoed. Considering we're not dead, yes, I suppose. You would think they would be interested why we were being shot up and the rest rather than our little jaunt around Maya B, Sima replied, shuffling her legs before crossing them, her flight suit making a slight plastic sound. This might be canon. Or Palin. Or both, I guess. As far as I am aware, we haven't broken any laws, though this is an anarchy system, and they can make up whatever laws they want. I bet you this is about intellectual property. There was a clang of the door, punctuated by a flickering of the lights. Sima and Eros sat on a bunk in a holding cell. It was squalid. The only place they could sit without fear of death from infection was the bed, although that still felt like a risk. They were thus both in their Remlock helmets for dramatic effect. A woman stepped up to the glass and spoke, the voice echoing around, muffled by the glass and the small holes to allow minimal airflow. You'll be free to go in a little over 20 minutes. We are finalizing our sweep of your vessel. Given your reluctance in opening it, it took a little longer to perform the level of penetrating scans we required. We noticed it had 2 frameshift drives. For exactly what purpose? She said, looking at Sima and then switching to Eros. Experimentation. We have a Federation's license for it. Yes, we know. So, why do you associate with the Thargoids? Associate with what? We got attacked by one, and tried to do some research. We got attacked with a Thargoid weapon. We're the victims here, Sima replied, drawing the woman's attention for a moment. We know what you are, Eros Madelung. Palin, get your ass in here, Eros shouted. The woman looked to her left, and the door opened with a clang and the sound of footsteps. Eros, good to see you again. I hear you nearly got splattered across space. It would have been a shame to hear of an esteemed colleague die in such a grisly manner, he said slowly, his hands behind his back. Ishmael, we got attacked, and you joke about it? I assume all you're interested in is the data for the Institute, and nothing else, Eros responded, standing up from the bed. Oh, I'm not a thief, Eros, if that's what you think. I've done ergosphere experiments before. I doubt you could discover something new there. However, the Thargoids are, you might say, an area of my expertise. I simply request you turn over any useful data you have. Request? Yes. Thargoids are an area in which you excel. You're probably the only person in the galaxy who could probably recover a shutdown pulse weapon and integrate it with human technology. I don't call this a request. I'm in a prison cell. This is bargaining. Open the cell, Palin said. The woman began tapping on the control panel beside the glass. It wasn't my intention. I simply requested the Ant Hill people to hold you until I arrived. I didn't realize that my flippant language could result in your arrest. Do you have any useful data? Eros, we need to know what we are up against. With the Aegis, we've developed the weaponry to level the playing field. But we just cannot continue to backpedal. The Thargoids have the ability to basically be anywhere at any time they want. We need to crack what allows them to manipulate and navigate in which space like they do. Look, I'll give you all of the data on the Thargoids I have. Heck, if we encounter any more, I'll even send that to you. But I'm not sure how useful a little bit of observational data and a wake scan can really be to you. If you saw the logs, you will see that someone out there is using Thargoid tech. Is that yours? That is unfortunate. But yes, a device was stolen from an Aegis lab about a month ago. It is still under investigation. We believed them to be simple raiders trying to make the big leagues. I suggest fitting more than a mining lance to that asper of yours. Sure, but what cost? Sima said. Call it payment for the data, Sima. What is your preference? Wait, who says we're getting weapons? We're not guns for hire, Eros said in a concerned tone. Railgun on the remaining medium, and I think the distributor would work more or less alright with a pulse on the smalls. We have a spare Gauss cannon if you fancy it, should you encounter any more Thargoids. At least you can bruise them a little. The pump span reaching optimal speeds, the cargo ramp area filling with a high-pitched hum. Are you sure you don't want the SRV? Sima asked over the radio. No, Eros said, looking down the ramp as it cracked open, moving downwards, breaking the vacuum seal, and then began to angle itself. No, you don't, or no, you're not sure. You know what I mean, Sima. Stop being picky. The backpack will give me 60 minutes out there. Thanks for getting me close. Eros began to walk down the steps at the side of the ramp just as it made contact with the soil. Reaching the bottom, he stepped onto the red surface. Ahead of him, a field of bark mounds. He stepped forward, gently balancing his foot at first to prevent him tripping. As he moved out from under the ship, a deep blue gas giant hung in the sky against an almost blinding flare of white from the local A-class star. Eros walked slowly towards the mounds. The gravity was very low, and walking was awkward, and the temptation to simply kick off the surface as though in zero gravity was overwhelming. Reaching the nearest mound, Eros held out an XRF device and pressed it against a shining deposit that was growing on the surface. He attached the device to his belt and held onto the mound with one hand and the deposit with the other, carefully pulling it loose. In his hand was a pure single crystal of yttrium. He opened a small box and placed it on the rocky surface, scanned over it with an ion gauge, making a quick mental note of the ambient pressure and that of the box as it degassed into the hard vacuum. He slowly placed a crystal into it and attached it to his backpack. He retrieved another box and pre-opened while looking over the field, his head-up display flickering signals of metallic growths. As he began to move, he noticed the bay under the asp light up. Sima was launching the SRV. Despite driving it slowly, dust was being kicked everywhere. Sima, can you keep the driving to a minimum until I have the samples? I'm going to go over to that crater we saw on the way down. I'll take a look around the mounds when you're done. He saw her point to her left and give him a salute as the SRV slowly began to crawl towards the west and then rapidly accelerate and engage its thrusters. Let me know if you find anything cool. Doubtful, but sure. Have fun gardening. An hour later, Eros stepped into the cockpit and jumped into the flight seat. He looked at the sensors. Sima's SRV was either out of range or its transponder has been turned off. He looked at the communications console and broadcast on open frequencies. Sima? Sima, are you out there? The asp slowly climbed, the thrust required to lift its frame only slightly disturbing the dust. He looked down at the tracks left by the SRV and began to tilt and follow them. They occasionally disappeared and reappeared as the SRV made more of a bunny hop across the surface than being driven. Approximately 4 minutes later, the asp crests the ridge of a local crater. As it does, the instruments begin to flicker. There is no audible warning from Celeste, though something is clearly wrong. Eros sees the lights of the SRV flickering in a small depression on the parabolic curve of the crater, near the rim, roughly 1 kilometer ahead of him. He brings the asp to a stop for a moment. Eros flicks a few toggles, extending several probes from the utility mount. The Hall effect senses brick-walled as pulse trains came in time with instruments flickering. There were other issues too. A flurry of ions were also hitting the vessel at a near constant rate. He decided that he needed to simply risk it and recover the SRV, hoping the hardened systems of the asp would allow for a pickup without having the whole ship collapse from the sky. He slowly moved the asp over the SRV and activated the hangar camera and carefully aligned it with the target. Activating the clamps, the SRV rotated slightly and began to lift from the surface. In time with the pulses, the SRV would appear to drop and cease its ascent. Once inside the bay, Eros nosed down and pulled back on the throttle, retreating the way he came. The disturbances appeared to stop once he dropped back below the horizon of the crater rim. He turned his attention to the SRV bay. Turning on the camera, he saw Sima attached to the chair, although tightly curled into the fetal position. He leveled the ship and brought it down to the ground as quickly as he could without collapsing the landing gear. He departed the cockpit as though in zero gravity and headed directly towards the bay, reaching it in less than a minute. The protective ball slid open, rotating its middle section and exposing Sima to the dry air of the ship. She shivered and shook as the entrance to the bay opened, revealing Eros as he planted himself on the deck, medical pack in hand. Sima was largely unresponsive, holding tight in her egg-shaped ball. He couldn't get anything coherent from her, just whispers and mutters. He took great displeasure in doing it, although, after 3 hours of failing to bring her round, he sedated her and placed her in a medical pod. It would at least keep her safe and maintain sleep while he monitored. Her vitals and brain activity appearing completely within the norms, Eros set to his new task, finding out exactly what had happened. He looked over the visual logs. There appeared to be nothing special in the area. The surface probes had not picked up anything from orbit, and on the way down, no usual transmissions, signals, or much else. A regular glide planetfall. He would need to take more data and do a careful peek over the rim of the crater. Eros had driven the SRV most of the way up the side of the rim. He had come to a stop due to a hint of low-level interference on the radio instrument crudely mounted on the top of the storage tank using vacuum tape. Locking the wheels, he released the canopy and climbed down from the hamster ball and carefully walked around the back of the SRV, retrieving an umbilical and attaching it to the back of his suit. He opened the side of the tank and pulled out 2 large suitcase-like objects. Normally, they would feel rather heavy. In this gravity, it was only inertia which he had to fight with. Slowly, he made small hops to the side of the rim. About 10 meters or so from the top, he sees a strange image flash before his eyes. His reflex was to close them, and he turned his head to the side as though trying to avoid being hit by something. What was that? He asked himself. He had never experienced hallucinations before, at least not any unexpected ones or tricks of light. He knelt down and shuffled backwards a little. Scraping away the soft dust with his hands, he made a small flat area and placed the cases down and flipped each one open. In one was a control console, in the other a small drone. He picked up the drone and attached miniature ion thrusters to it. He attached several small instruments to its belly and flipped it over and gave it a gentle push into the sky. Moving his attention back onto the console, he rapidly pressed and flicked buttons and toggles. Above, the drone stabilized and hovered. As data began streaming to the console, Eros flew the drone over the rim of the crater. The first occurrence was the ion wind, instantly interfering with the sensors. Eros could see an object embedded in the opposite side of the crater. It lit up largely in UV. As he looked closer, he could see that it was surrounded by a silvery mirror shine, as though it had turned its surroundings into solid metal. Once more, something flashes across Eros' eye and through his mind. He feels an intense sense of dread. Although he is unable to work out why his mood took a sudden hit other than coinciding with the ion pulses from the object, it felt as though he was removed from his body just for a moment. He thought about the images and couldn't really make anything out that he recognized. He noted an increasing magnetic activity emanating from the object, in pulses roughly 30 seconds apart, each with slightly different duration and strength, but 30 seconds apart nonetheless. Every 8th cycle, Eros would receive chaotic visions and a sensation of being outside of his body. With each, he started to feel more and more nervous and more paranoid. He finally moved the drone towards the object. As he reached the point near to where he located the SRV, the drone picked up a large magnetic pulse out of sync with the norm and instantly cut its connection with the console. It hovered and remained in place. At the same moment, Eros had the compulsion to stand, but it also felt as though he couldn't really feel his body. The resulting movement was him to straighten his legs and perform an awkward leap into the sky. Once above the crater rim, he began to realize exactly why he had found Sima in the way he did. He began to see almost constant images and experience chaotic and confusing shifts of emotion. Him floating up and then back towards the ground didn't really enter into his brain. Instead, he was flooded with chaos, which started to make more coherent images as old memories and nightmares began to replay. The moment he dropped back below the rim, he was released. He flailed to position himself for a safe landing. On his knees, he looked back at the asp. "We should just get out of here. It isn't worth it," Sima said, her voice slow and tired. "At this point, I think you're right. I don't feel right. And we're pretty much shielded from that thing by 50 meters of rock, electromagnetic shielding and physical shielding. We need a brain scan when we get back to the nearest dock." "What do you think it is?" "I've looked through so many records and reports, I draw a blank. What we can see from the drone is that it appears to be very ordered in appearance, which makes it appear as though it's man-made, or at least intelligence-made. I don't want to say it's a weapon, but at the very least it's an area denial device, very capable of affecting humans at the mental level, and from a distance of a few kilometers. Rock in a hard place. If it is a weapon, it's here for a reason. So, what is that reason? If it's alien, should we leave it to fall into the hands of unknowns?" "Exactly. Regardless, can't stay here. We've been here for 2 weeks and moved away from the site. We didn't see it on our way down here originally, but we do pick it up as an anomaly on the sensors now. Ramtar, we should inform him, see if he's interested, or can shed light on it. I'm not sure it's Guardian. We're in the wrong area, but I do trust him more than the alternatives. 3 days later, the Asp arrived and requested docking at Phoenix Space. Gently touching down, like many ships had before it, no fanfare or drama. The difference was that the Asp was met near the pad by Ramtar himself, rather than his many apprentices. Eros and Sima stood across from a table in a meeting room. Ramtar stood opposite, leaning on the table, looking at the display. It is most unusual, Eros, that you come to me, though the data packet you sent me was most interesting. I've heard of your antics, performing an ergosphere flight. He chuckled in disbelief and held his chin. The flying was performed by Sima here. Sima nodded and smiled. So, any ideas based on that snippet what it might be? Well, it is hard to say. You didn't really send much, although I can tell you 2 things. It isn't Thargoid or Guardian. The signatures just don't really match. Thargoid systems, by their very nature, are quite organic, and are thus quite imperfect. Sort of ironic, really. Guardians are almost robotic, in fact, completely robotic. It's quite like our own systems, really. Perfect. The data you sent me, it's a mix. So probably human, then, Sima said quickly. Well, by deduction, it's hard to claim anyone else built it other than us, but that too isn't clear. If I could have a complete data set, it would be most useful. Eros placed a small storage device on the table and pushed it over. Ramtar took it and plugged it into the desk. A flurry of screens lit up. Ramtar, initially frowning, turned his expression to one of shock. Oh my, this thing. He sucked his lip and brought his finger to it and ran the nail across. This is really bad, extremely dangerous. You saw visions? Chaotic thoughts? Yes. It is emitting what looks like an inverted mental map. I don't think this device is human, although it is designed to affect humans. The pattern is just so obvious. It's been years since I've looked at mental mapping for AI-assisted flight control, but even an undergrad could identify that as a mental map. Isn't that illegal? Sima asked. The AI, I mean. And what is a mental map? It's about as illegal as you can get. It's why I don't work on it anymore. Ramtar paused, seeing Eros wanting to answer the second question. A map is like taking a snapshot of somebody's thoughts process, memory, and freezing it in electrical signals. I've never seen one of these before. I was a gravimetrics student, not a biological science one. My guess at danger is that that thing is projecting a somewhat destructive map on anyone or anything who gets close. Ramtar was looking at the data and making some preliminary analysis. I think it's a telepathic weapon. I mean, well, telepathy doesn't really exist, but this is near it as you can get to the description. We could never get the electromagnetic fields to project correctly, to oscillate, or to be of high enough magnitudes to induce anything more than a god helmet effect, he replied, looking up for only a few moments. The god helmet is ancient. It's a fun parlor trick and still requires basically a full head contact and an enclosure. This had the works, though. Full outer-body experience with chaotic thought and memory recall. It was horrible, Eros replied, Sima nodding along with him, having experienced it to the point of incapacitation. Please, tell me you destroyed it, Ramtar asked. That is a negative, Sima replied. Oh, okay, well, you need to get back there and destroy it. It is an incredibly valuable artifact, but it's far too dangerous to even exist. Unless someone else skimmed the transmission or tracked you, or happened to pick up the unusual signals while passing through the system, only us three should know about it. I don't want that thing anywhere near human space, let alone near me. Other than a powerful conventional shield or frameshift field, I have no other idea how one could neutralize the effect. You have a good setup on that asp, and even you report seeing some residual bleed through. Sorry to do this, but you have to get back out there as soon as you can. Alright, but first we need a brain scan for Sima and I. Check for oddities and damage. Absolutely. As space-time unfurled around the asp, dropping from witch space and back into supercruise, the same white star met the ship and began to bake its armor. Naturally, the heat exchangers activated to counter it, emanating an orange-white glow on the shadow side of the ship. Destination reached, Celeste announced. Eros ran through several checks, flipping a few toggles and reactivating the communication devices, and extending the sensor sweep. Let's get about 50 light seconds from the star, and then we can have a quick peek on the scope for any unusual activity, Eros said, Sima acknowledging soon afterwards. They moved the ship, parked, and she began her task. Alright, moon is centered and locked, and I'm going to refresh the data. Stand by. Okay, I do have one biological location. The sensors are giving me spurious readings, though. So I guess that means whatever it is still active, at some level. The audio feedback and downshift is giving me something similar to a typical water world, though, yeah, that isn't a water world as we know. Okay, good. Let's head there. We can snipe the surface and keep our distance. And then we just get the hell out of here and chalk that one down to experience. Discovery of a millennia destroyed. You sound almost bitter. Maybe a little, but the more I think about it, the more I agree with Ramtar. It's ironically important to understand what it is, but it's also deadly to know what it is. Opening a secure channel. Eros flipped a toggle and pressed a few buttons on the console to his left. After roughly a minute, Ramtar's voice came through the communications array. Doctor? We are in the system, proceeding with the plan. Do you have any more information to give us? Changes or recommendations? The only thing I've figured out is that you might be able to counter or better shield the effects by modulating your shields. I can upload a firmware update if you want, though I still recommend destroying it. Any clues to its origin? Or is it still a mystery? Eros asked. Well, on that, I have a working theory that is Thargoid. And not only that, but it's also very old. So what you're saying is expectrable. Yes, expectrable. The device appears to have been developed as an equivalent to the mic. The line cut abruptly. Well, that isn't a great sign, Sima said, her voice echoing in the cockpit. Eros sighed in agreement and began towards the planet and its moon. As they approached with the site locked in and a navigation system, they checked the system for radio chatter, frameshift fields, or any other activity, human or otherwise. As Eros pitched the nose down to enter orbital cruise, a sudden jolt shook the ship. What? Eros managed to say before being cut off by Celeste. Delta potential beyond threshold limits. Emergency stop. The ship abruptly slammed out of cruise and into irregular flight, alarms sounding and flashing around the cockpit. As the asp rotated, Eros could see the cause. A Majestic-class interdictor was clawing itself up from hyperspace and into orbit. That asp had passed over the enormous entry wake and tripped its safeties. As the sensors flickered online, the Majestic read as 40 kilometers distant. Shut it all down and pop a heatsink. Configure for silent running. Our vector takes us to the surface. We have about 12 hours before we make landfall. Shutting down all systems, including life support. Have the chemical reactor on standby. We might need to top it up every 20 minutes or so. Roger, Sima replied, activating her helmet as the coolant flush began pulling the heat from the armor itself, causing the hull to make groaning sounds. Eros, I don't think this will help us too much. I think they are already deploying fighters. You might be right. We can at least feign being hapless tourists, I suppose. Though the specifications of the systems on that thing, they could probably even tell they dragged us out of frameshift. We'd be an artifact on the return potential. They would just need to compensate for it. Checking range and telemetry. Eros activated sensors for a brief moment. Fighters were inbound. The ship was hailed immediately. So much for that. Don't bring all the systems online just yet. We need to appear mostly harmless. Lakon Echo Romeo Oscar, this is Xandar Lance Sigma 1. You're in a violation of Military Cordon 15-5. Power down and await further instructions. Copy that, Sigma 1. Violation is accidental. Your hyperspace tunnel knocked out many of our systems, including the frameshift drive. We're dead in the water. Negative. We know who you are, Dr. Madelung. We know why you are here. Comply and surrender yourself to our custody. You are heavily outgunned. Stabilize your craft and await instruction. Eros hated to simply roll over, but truth be told, he didn't fancy facing a broadside set of capital-class railguns either. Eros and Sima stood side by side, their hands shackled in front of them, their asp magnetically clamped to an auxiliary bay a short drop behind them. Either side were armed guards, who appeared to have been briefed not to expect any trouble, other than the initial boarding and detainment involving lots of shouting and pointing of rifles. The whole situation appeared relaxed. A door opened ahead. The two guards stamped their feet to attention, and a woman, probably the XO, based on the dress uniform, entered with a small entourage of lower rank personnel. Doctor, I will make this brief. It is most fortunate for us that we were able to apprehend you when we did. We have been tracking you for quite some time now. Under the Imperial Charter, as an Imperial citizen, we have two options for you, based on the danger you pose. Excuse me? Eros interrupted. What exactly are we being charged with? The woman lifted a reader and pressed it. Association with fugitives, association with a Federation sympathetic cause or faction, illegal experimentation around complex stellar objects, concealment of strategic information from the Emperor or proxies, risk of radicalization, and terrorism. So, all false charges then? Eros tilted his head and frowned. You and I both know the score here. I'm a person of interest to you because you think I found a weapon of some sort. Nothing else. Sima looked at him and rolled her eyes and sighed. He looked at her and then back at the officer. Your friend? Sima, is it? She has cause for alarm. So you admit you found a weapon on that moon below, and yet you take this information to Ramtar, an outsider? This very conversation could easily be used to secure a conviction. So, tell us more about this weapon. Cooperation is in your best interest. Oh, cut the pretense. Cooperation is irrelevant, and my life is cheap. If I answer any questions, it's because my interest is to prevent tragedy or further problems. The outcome, once we are done, is hardly that I'm going to be knighted now, is it? I do ask that you allow Sima to leave unharmed. She is under my command. Any wrongdoing is therefore my responsibility. You are not in a position to make any demands or bargains here, Doctor. With the press of a button, a monitor screen displayed the outside camera feed looking down at the planet, the artifact marked. This object, we are to believe you stumbled upon it. We find that a little too convenient. Eros smiled. It all seemed rather stupid now. Their original goal on that planet was quite specialized, but ordinary. I was collecting ultra-high purity single crystals of various elements. I needed them to trade with a contact. I have to upgrade my research frameshift device. The central chamber, you see, needs expansion such that I can more accurately Enough! The woman cut him off mid-sentence. You want me to believe that you did, in fact, stumble upon this system. I don't want you to believe anything, but that is indeed the truth. Check the surface. You will find a biological field and a bunch of SRV tracks that don't exactly go straight to the artifact. You will also find footprints, my footprints. The officer waved one of her subordinates over and said something quickly to him. Her attention was still fixed on Eros. There was an awkward silence for about 20 seconds. The subordinate then spoke, confirming his statement. It is a weapon, you claim. I actually don't know what it is. All I can say for sure is that it has a detrimental effect upon one's mental state. Direct exposure would probably be enough to do some serious damage, even cause brain death. From what distance? Sima was exposed at about 3 kilometers inside an SRV. Life support had her in a medically induced coma for about 3 days before she began to respond to stimuli. I was exposed from about 4 kilometers, directly wearing just a remlock. It made me want to, well, I don't know. It was chaotic. This is hardly a doomsday weapon, a damn waste of time. She looked to her other subordinate. Have the dropship deploy for recovery. Advise them to keep the shields up and have a recon team assess. Do an external extraction if required. Look, we have no idea what it can do. I have ground-penetrating radar data that shows it's a pretty large object, buried deep. The exposed surface is only an opening of about 2 or 3 square meters. You have no idea what you're doing. On the edge of the video feed, something catches Eros's attention. The flash of a frame shift or low wake. It is unclear what just dropped in. The battery backup lights turned on slowly, lighting the room, which had been plunged into darkness moments earlier. Eros felt his shackles loosen. The privacy glass, which lined the left-hand side of the room, also cleared, showing the docking area in similar darkness and inactivity. Why are the comms down? I thought we had redundancies and countermeasures for this. How many people have to die before the Empire gets hold of its arrogance? How many Thargoids do you think it takes to take down a Majestic? Eros asked. Thargoids are no problem for the Empire, Doctor. We have not lost any vessels to the Zeno. Eros instantly broke out laughing, his head lowered. Bullshit, just bullshit. I know, because other than the poor form and etiquette, you're a poor liar. If you had been keeping such close tabs on me, you'd have obliterated that orca the moment you got a visual ID. I do not trust your ability to keep yourself or anyone else safe from the Thargoids. It is your arrogance that gets countless people killed. In situations such as these, I'd rather trust the ability of my pilot in that asp over all the guns and armor you have on this thing, Eros streamed. The group of people who had initially entered the room one by one began to leave, talking amongst themselves, barking orders at each other, and shouting orders down the corridors when they left the room. He looked at Sima, who met his eye. He sharply raised his head and moved his eyes, not at all inconspicuous, but clearly he told her he was planning on making a run for it. She nodded and smiled. In truth, no one was actually looking at them at this time. Eros slowly flipped one hand from his shackle and took hold of its center. As he began to slide out the second, the main power came back online, and it snapped closed in response. As the people in the room looked around, Eros jumped, taking hold of the guard on his left with his free arm. Holding onto the top of the rifle, he began to struggle. Sima followed suit, although still shackled, diving to the right into the other. Let us back to our ship and leave. Guards? The woman was interrupted by the ship's PA system. All crew, battle stations, Condition Alpha, multiple Thargoid interceptor-class vessels just dropped in on us. Fighter pilots report to your assigned stations. Everyone to your stations, and, guards, if you kill them, you kill them. We have our data. I guess you were right all along, Doctor. The woman turned and left as Eros and Sima scuffled with the guards. You don't need to do this. You need to get off this ship. They aren't ready to fight the Thargoids. The guard fighting with Eros stopped and began tapping out to signal resignation. Eros began to let off. You need to get to a fighter or a ship and just get the hell out of here. Don't fight. They'll only come after you if you fight. The guard looked at Eros as he loosened his grip. He quickly headbutted him and fired his rifle at the other guard and Sima. Dazed slightly, Eros resumed fighting the best he could, wrapping himself around the guard tightly and attempting to choke him. He heard him scream out briefly as Eros heard a thud, as Sima had just clubbed him with the rifle. Come on, we need to go. Sima stood, rifle in her still shackled hands. Without saying a single word, Eros sprung towards the door through which they originally came. Their asp was only a matter of a minute or so away. Gliding down towards the loading bay, the area was largely abandoned. Where is everyone? Eros thought to himself. He had expected a flurry of people moving around, guards trying to stop them. Instead, there was almost nothing. Eros's remlock activated, perhaps answering his question, as his steady drift towards the bay turned into a more rushed event, being drawn by the airflow. Eros stopped himself with a grab bar and looked back as Sima awkwardly did the same, letting out a muted moan. Keep going. The flow isn't bad. We can easily make it, Eros shouted, as the air began to thin, and so with it, the rush. Eros glided over to the loading ramp and took hold of the nearest handbar. He looked back as Sima was hesitating at the outer wall of the loading bay. He waved his hand for her to come quickly. He squinted, looking at her carefully. She was clutching her side with her hand. Her helmet had some condensation on the inside. Sima? Eros shouted, though she would never hear him. He rotated himself horizontally and pushed himself as hard as he could off the ramp towards her. It was an agonizing wait for them both, him in worry, her in pain of an open wound exposed to vacuum, blood forming a gooey ice around her hand, but not coagulating. He slammed into the wall next to her with his feet, took hold of her and leaped back towards the ship. He tried to rotate around by sliding his hands along the deck and make a comfortable landing on the ramp. As they made a somewhat clumsy ball and bounced on the ramp, Eros let go and sprang to his feet, closing the ramp and starting the repressurization process. He took the medical kit from the sidewall and returned to her. He watched as the pressure monitor on his helmet began increasing, every step wanting to release his helmet so he could talk to her. He removed the can of spray for the purpose of cleaning and sealing small wounds. As the pressure increased, the mess of blood rapidly turned into a sticky liquid. He could see pain and induced panic in her eyes as he lifted her hands and looked down. Eros took a cutter from the bag and began making a wide hole in the suit to see the extent of her injuries. The wound wasn't a through and through. The rifle used was ballistic rather than laser. It had probably passed through the guard and then stopped in her lower left abdomen. The vacuum looked like it had exacerbated the problem. The bruising was extensive. It looked like a burn wound, her skin a deep purple, black, and blue. As the pressure reached 90%, Eros released both of their helmets and sprayed the foaming liquid onto the wound. Sima let out first a loud scream followed by a low grunt and growl as she grimaced and screwed up her face, trying to control the pain. She gasped and took a breath as Eros looked down at her, checking her for other wounds. Eros, go. We have to go. Just go. I have to get you to the medical bay. He began to lift her from the deck. Listen to me. Get the ship started. Get us out of here. Right after you're safe. Eros, Sima shouted, tears in her eyes as he guided them towards the door. The medical room was 2 doors away. As they passed out of the loading bay, Sima grabbed him by the collar of his suit with one hand and held his neck and chin with the other. Eros, please, I will make it there. Just get yourself out of here. She pulled him close and kissed his cheek. He continued to the archway of the medical room. Okay, you get your way, Sima. Just get into a pod. Let me get these off of you. He began fumbling with the shackles and looking around for something he could either break them with or a device to decode them. In that split second, Sima shook him and looked deep into his eyes. Go. Now. She pushed him away, knocking herself towards the medical pod and him out of the door. I'm coming back as soon as I can, he said, taking one last look at her before punting off the nearest surface towards the cockpit. Moments later, he threw himself over the flight seat and began rapidly bringing all systems online. As he did so, the ship shook as a Thargoid scout smashed through the roof of the bay and bounced off the deck before embedding itself where the control area used to be. With a pause that felt like an eternity, it exploded, spraying a mist of green all around, which instantly started melting the surroundings. Warning, corrosive substance detected, hull integrity compromised, Celeste announced. As the ship's systems came online one by one, he looked at the hull monitor as the hologram flickered and displayed the estimate flight frame integrity as 80%. The thrusters finally came online. Eros disengaged the landing clamps and began to retract the gears. Celeste, is Sima inside a medical pod? He asked. Medical pod 0-2 has been active for 32 seconds. Crewmember Basirat is inside. He pulled back on the flight stick, lifting the nose, and bounced the rear of the ship off the pad. The main doors were closed, although the scout had made a rather large hole through the Majestic. He needed to only make about 20 meters. Celeste, activate weapon systems. Lock forward fire. What is the old saying? 2 birds with 1 stone? Eros flicked a toggle. Silent running, engaged. Eros squinted his eyes and squeezed the trigger. Eros was first pushed backwards and then forward as the asp burst through the side of the Majestic. He looked around, frantically trying to assess the situation. He had deactivated hardpoints, not wanting to rip off any equipment as they forced their way out, hoping that it also might serve a second purpose, allowing a quick getaway, unpursued by the Thargoids. He counted 3 interceptors, and more scouts than he'd ever cared to count. They were largely being engaged by fighters, as the Majestic's main guns fired in an almost rhythmic manner. The asp was moving away, thrusters firing at full capacity. A railgun shot thundered past the bow. "Oh, come on, you've far worse things to worry about," Eros shouted, and began to attempt to give the asp a more sporadic flight pattern. He looked towards the planet and rotated the ship, looking back over the Majestic as it successfully blasted through the petal and heart of one of the interceptors. As the asp closed the distance, another railgun volley came in. To Eros, as though in slow motion, the white glowing projectile moved in front of the stars and under the ship. The asp lurched and rotated downwards with a jolt and an enormous bang. Main thruster, right, offline. Control system error, armor penetration, aft. Structural integrity compromised, Celeste announced. "Celeste, be quiet. Now is not the time." Eros opened the manual control panel from the right of his flight seat and flicked up a toggle for the drive control and tried to restart the left side main thruster. They interlock off should either one fail to prevent spin. The ship groaned and it slowly began to give power. Trimming the controls to prevent huge yaw, Eros regained rough control. His heart raced. He expected another shot to come in at any moment. At this range, their tracking would probably suffer a little, although the asp was now severely crippled, and speed was never its forte, probably evening the score. Space was a fireworks show of fighters and countless guns. It would be beautiful, except for the realization that this was an all-out war. The group of Thargoids continued their assault. Much to Eros's conflicted sense of relief, a synchronized shutdown pulse was projected from each of the interceptors, and the lights aboard the Majestic flickered and went dark. Whatever countermeasures they had, they were not effective. With the asp shutting down as well, it continued to drift downward towards the planet, its meager gravitational field doing almost nothing to aid their escape. Eros looked down as the Thargoids began firing corrosive weapons at the Majestic, streams of Thargon steamrolling through the armor and causing ripples of explosions. The Majestic was ready to fold in half already. He thought of all the lives on board. It was such a senseless waste to fight the Thargoids with nothing but arrogance. Their presence here gave credit to Ramtar's theory that the device was of Thargoid origin. Had Eros found something they had been destroying countless INRA affiliates to find? The power flickered back on. As the sensors came back online, he saw the fuzzied signature of an interceptor and its Thargons moving towards them. Eros checked the hardpoints were already shut down. He could not fight, and he would not fight. His thoughts were only of submission. A railgun slug flew past the canopy and out into space. With it, the yellow-green entrails of a direct hit scored on the Thargoid in pursuit. Celeste, status of crew member Sima. Crew member Basirat, unconscious. Status, critical. Recommend immediate hospitalization. How long does she have? Can we put her in cryo? He asked quietly, his voice shaking. Subject probability of death during procedure is 95%. Probability of death during reanimation is 97%. Prognosis, cryostasis would cause death. Shit. Plot a course for the nearest known medical facility. Follow bearing 290 Majestic class at 3.5 kilometers. Not that one, we cannot go there. Plotting. Please wait. Nearest location, approximately 350 light-years. Nan jumps. ETA, Nan minutes. Main drive, inoperable. Figures. I guess this is it then. Eros uncoupled himself from the flight seat. A railgun strike on the asp could probably cause a pretty severe injury, but at this moment, it would probably come as somewhat of a mercy. Eros floated through the door into the medical bay. He saw the casket. Sima was inside, her head pressed against the view window. Floating up to it, he looked at the readout. She was being kept alive, although it was doing little more than maintaining her. Without better care, she would die. The Majestic was the only hope. Although the Thargoids had her well and truly pinned, it would not escape, even if its command structure came to its senses. Eros opened the casket and slid the door away. Sima slowly opened her eyes. Everything about the look on her face said she knew what was happening. Eros looked down at the shackle. She spoke quietly. "Don't let me die a slave, Eros." I won't. He had with him his toolkit. Her shackles were always on his mind. He knew that it was all he could do for her, to free her of the binds. They had both loosened during the shutdown pulse, but without her moving her arms, she remained bound. Luckily, he could get a separator into the small gaps. He began pumping the device, which slowly twisted and malformed the metal. After 10 minutes of fighting, he finally freed one of her hands. She placed it on his shoulder. Eros, it's fine. It's fine. Just let me see the stars. Anything you want, Sima." He held on to her and slowly glided around the corridors and to the cockpit. As he did, he saw a shadow pass over the ship. "Close your eyes, Sima," he said softly. She was barely conscious, her eyes already closed. "Please, just leave us alone. We're no threat to you," he said, as though the Thargoid that loomed close outside could understand. It paused and vibrated its 4 remaining petals and rotated, closing them in towards its core. It drifted upwards and flew back towards the Majestic. "Okay, Sima, open your eyes." She slowly cracked them and began to look around. "Eros, don't blame yourself. I know you will, so please don't. I'm glad we got to know you, and I'm sorry I can't fly with you anymore." Without another word, she closed her eyes and stopped breathing. Eros held on to her and began to weep. A single life blinked into the nothingness. At that same moment, behind them, the Majestic cracked in half and then exploded. It seemed pale in comparison. Eros began to hear the hull being peppered by small pieces of shrapnel. Ahead of him was the planet, the asp being slowly propelled towards it by a combination of gravity and being pockmarked by the explosion. Eros drifted with Sima to the lowered cockpit section, and he placed her into the flight seat. He activated the escape pod, which caused the seat to wrap around her in a casket, and held her in place. Eros pushed back upwards to the command seat and strapped himself in. There was only silence and a sound of death rattling at the rear. An interceptor returned, placing itself between the asp and the planet. It opened its petals and scanned the ship, and paused for a few moments. The gill-like structures on its petals turned from red to a green-yellow, and it began to fold them back once more into its core. Eros looked down at his hands and his flight suit. He was covered in Sima's blood. He wondered for a moment what it looked like to the alien outside. Did it think Eros had killed her? Did it have any concept of loss? Everything Eros had been told suggested they didn't really have a social structure further than that of bees or ants. Scouts and interceptors were by all means drones, and, as such, expendable. More logical was that the Thargoid knew the asp was not a threat. "Frameshift anomaly detected," Celeste announced. With it, all but the Thargoid that tracked them snapped into witch space. The Thargoid rotated 180 degrees to face the planet and began to slowly accelerate. When reaching roughly 5 kilometers distant, it turned once more to face the asp. Eros watched it through sore eyes, confused as what it was doing. He had assumed it was there to finish him off and leave, although apparently not quite yet. The planet grew ever larger and was now filling most of the view. The Thargoid approached once more, this time stopping what seemed like inches away from the cockpit. Eros felt his instincts kick in, telling him to either attack or run. To him, there was basically only silence, loss, and a giant alien. The single eye-like core structure, a dancing, swirling object that made it difficult to make out whether it was a cockpit or just an organic structure. He felt a small jolt as it pressed against the armored glass. Eros suddenly sat upright. The Thargoid responded by backing away slightly, and then nudging the asp once more. Was it trying to communicate? Eros raised its hand and made a motion as if to say, "Move back," pushing the palm of his hand towards it. The Thargoid responded by drifting backwards. "Celeste, bring all systems online except the weapons systems." As the ship responded, its retrothrusters began to sputter and fire, slowly bringing the ship's velocity under control. The Thargoid maintained a distance, as though watching an injured animal. Eros pulled on the controls. They became less responsive as the systems began to fail. As though organic, the asp was dying a long, drawn-out death. Eros was following the Thargoid, although he was starting to veer off course as they dropped under 10 kilometers altitude. He shut down the main thrusters and tried to navigate entirely on secondary maneuvering. The groan of the ship came in a different pitch, but it still groaned nonetheless. It became clear that his landing would be rough, even though the gravity was extremely low. The ship would still have a hard time stopping. Eros hesitated. Now at 5 kilometers, he toggled the main thrusters back online and cursed himself for ever shutting them down, as it made a stuttering sound. He rotated the ship to attempt a rocket-style landing. As he brought up the thrust, the main drive continued to protest, although ultimately he knew it was providing something as he began to counter the yaw it was generating. The thruster let go roughly 300 meters above the surface. Quickly, Eros flipped the ship forward and deployed the landing gear. It surprisingly opened and locked in place without issue. Eros held his breath as the ship hit the surface, causing a spray of dust to fire out in all directions, as the thrusters still tried to slow the descent. Not a bad landing, but not great. Eros began looking at the controls, trying to figure out which systems were online or operable. "Damn, why prolong this? I should have just crashed," Eros said, as he saw that despite life support being good, the main fuel tank was ruptured. At the rate of loss, it would be about an hour before it ran dry, leaving only the auxiliary tank, barely enough to get out of system, should he even get the frameshift drive operating. If not, it would be 25 minutes in remlock, followed by death or cryofreeze. Eros tilted forward, held his face, and sighed. "There is only one thing left to do," he said through his hands. 30 minutes later, Eros stood on the surface. Ahead of him, a small mound, the top adorned with a silver Hutton Mug. He knelt down and placed a hand against the mound. The soil softly drifted and rolled downwards. "I am so sorry," came a forced, labored voice, gasping to hold back tears. Taking a fistful of soil, he stood and nearly stumbled backwards. Another forced breath, and once again, silence. The white sun cast long, black, jagged shadows over the landscape as it passed near the mountains ahead in the distance. The environment briefly lit in several hues as the light passed behind the large cloud of debris that orbited above. He turned his head to the right and squinted, looking at the Thargoid interceptor as it hovered over the original target zone. It scanned the surface and rotated several times, while cycling colors. It deployed its Thargon swarm, each of them instantly propelling forwards and into the crater. It appeared to do this in sequence, a total of 3 swarms, all of which vanished out of view. Eros felt the ground rumble and shake as the interceptor began firing into the crater. The craft lit up green and yellow, and the crater exploded. Eros stumbled as tremors came in rapid sequence shortly after. After firing into the crater for a solid minute more, the Thargoid closed and rotated to face the downed asp, accelerating towards it. As though it saw Eros standing on the surface, it changed course and moved close. In any other circumstance, Eros would have been terrified, though, at this moment, he couldn't really feel anything. Very slowly, the Thargoid drifted in close, rotating as not to strike the surface. It completely filled his view, finally stopping an arm's length away. He lifted his hand and slowly placed it on the eye-like structure. Although organic in appearance, it was like solid glass, almost frictionless. Slowly it backed away, paused over the scene, and then turned into the sky and ascended, leaving Eros once again alone on the surface. Warning: oxygen at 5%. Rebreather reaching end of life. Eros forced another gasp of air and then turned slowly to look back at the Asp Explorer some 200 meters walk away. Smoke was flowing out of the hull and sinking to the surface like fluid. Stumbling and dragging his feet, he started to move. The vacuum maintained absolute silence, the only living environment maintained within the helmet worn by a broken human soul. The light began to disappear as shadow flowed over the surface like a creeping black ocean. Eros stumbled and vanished below. Well, if you made it that far, thanks very much for putting up with my probably dull voice. That was Exodus of the Mug. I wrote this after a little bit of inspiration on the Hutton Truckers Facebook group, a 5-part little story about a Sidewinder with a rogue AI. And I've written random sci-fi related things for many years, although I've never actually finished any projects. And so this one was the first project I actually finished, and so I felt it would be quite nice to put it out there. So I chose to read it audiobook style, and yeah, I think it worked pretty good. Like, once again, thanks a lot, and there might be a second part. I'm working on it, at least in written form. Whether I manage to finish it depends on whether I have enough inspiration. So, thanks a lot.